John 15, 1 through 12. I am the true vine. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vineyard keeper. He removes any of my branches that don't produce fruit, and he trims any branches that produces fruit, so that it will produce even more fruit. You are already trimmed because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, and I will remain in you. A branch that can't produce fruit by itself must remain in the vine. Likewise, you can't produce fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, then you will produce much fruit. Without me, you can't do anything. If you don't remain in me, you will be like a branch that is thrown out and dries up. Those branches are gathered up, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask for whatever you want and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified when you produce much fruit, and in this way prove that you are my disciples. Love each other. As the Father loved me, I too have loved you. Remain in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I kept my Father's commandments and remain in love, and remain in his love. I have also said these things to you, so that my joy will be in you, and your joy will be complete. This is my commandment: love each other just as I have loved you. Praise be to God.
Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, for you are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So today is the second week in our series called At Home. We've all spent so much time at home recently, so this series offers us a change of perspective. It's a tour of 5 legendary American homes, including Monticello, the Little House on the Prairie, and Emily Dickinson's homestead. These various residential archetypes can help us think about our own life at home, especially in light of faith. One thing that happens when you stay at home for long periods of time is you can develop cabin fever. And so I have a few cabin jokes for you. How does a cabin access the internet? It has to log on. What part of a cabin is almost always 90 degrees? The corners. And do you know the joke about the skunk that got inside the cabin? It really stinks, like most of my jokes do. The second stop of our tour of homes is Henry David Thoreau's cabin at Walden Pond. Now, if Jefferson's Monticello was grand and stately, Thoreau's wilderness home was plain and simple. And whereas Jefferson depended on slavery, Thoreau bitterly opposed it. Born in 1817, Thoreau grew up in Concord, Massachusetts, where the American Revolution began, the shot fired around the world. And he formed a friendship with Ralph Waldo Emerson while he was a student at Harvard. They became quite close and actually lived together for 3 years. Grief strengthened their bond even further after Emerson's son and Thoreau's brother both died. Emerson and Thoreau were part of a circle called the Transcendentalists, like-minded literary figures who emphasized intuition, self-reliance, and a fundamental belief in the goodness of humankind and the natural world. Eventually, Thoreau wanted to live in the woods and devote his time to writing. And since Emerson had recently purchased a woodlot around an old glacial kettle lake called Walden Pond, he invited Thoreau to stay there. Thoreau built probably the very first tiny house near that lake, and he moved in symbolically on the 4th of July in 1845. It was a one-room cabin, 10 by 15 feet, with a fireplace at one end and a door at the other. He furnished it with a bed, a table, a desk, and 3 chairs. He had a 3-inch mirror, a pair of tongs, a kettle, a skillet, a frying pan, a dipper, a wash bowl, 2 knives and forks, 3 plates, 1 cup, a spoon, a couple of jugs for oil and molasses, and a lantern. By comparison, most of us have considerably more rooms and more belongings in our homes. If you count my blender, my stand mixer, toaster, food processor, deep fryer, crock pot, electric tea kettle, multi-cooker, and the like, I probably have more specialty appliances in my kitchen than all the items in Thoreau's whole house. Of course, none of my gadgets would have been any use in his cabin without electricity, which is pretty much his point. Thoreau's goal was to live more simply. He said, "Our life is frittered away by detail. I say, let your affairs be as 2 or 3, and not 100 or 1,000. Instead of 1,000,000, count half a dozen, and keep your accounts on your thumbnail. Simplify, simplify." That was his motto. Thomas Dunn observes that whereas Jefferson tried to secure freedom by maximizing his possessions, Thoreau sought to be free by minimizing his. He felt that we needlessly enslave ourselves to our possessions. Now, if you adjust for inflation, Thoreau spent less than 1,000 of today's dollars to build his rustic cabin, and he lived in it for a little over 2 years. His neighbors were the birds, and he enjoyed being serenaded by wood thrush, veery, scarlet tanager, field sparrow, and whippoorwill, which are all birds that do not typically sing in town, in a village or a city. He had to be in the woods to hear them. Some people credit Thoreau as being the guiding spirit for our modern conservation movement. He wanted to commune with nature, but he also believed that by doing so, a person could become spiritually awake and morally reformed. From his perspective, the vast majority of people attend only to their physical needs, but there is so much more to life. He says, the millions are awake enough for physical labor, but only 1 in a million is awake enough for effectual intellectual exertion. Only 1 in 100 million to a poetic or divine life. To be awake is to be alive. And that was his ultimate goal. While living at the cabin at Walden, he studied nature, grew a garden, wrote in his journal, completed a survey of the lake, and finished his first book, which was a story based on an adventure that he had with his late brother, whom he was still grieving. During this time, Thoreau had not withdrawn from other people to become a hermit. The cabin was only 1.5 miles away from Concord. He often walked to the village, entertained visitors at home, and hired himself out as a surveyor. He says, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. In today's reading, Jesus reminds us that the vitality of our life comes from him. He says, "Abide in me as I abide in you." He uses the metaphor of fruit-bearing plants like grapes or berries and says, "I am the vine, you are the branches." He notes that a branch cut off from the main vine cannot bear fruit. It just withers and dies. By removing the dead branches, a vine grower promotes new growth. But did you know there's also a risk of too much growth? Left unattended, grapevines can put too much energy into creating shoots and leaves at the expense of making grapes. It may look alive, but it doesn't bear vital fruit. If the vine becomes overgrown, it needs further pruning. By removing the excess, the vine grower allows the branches to concentrate on producing grapes. Sometimes for us, things get out of balance in our lives. Our time and resources dissipate from neglect. Things that are trivial or unimportant take up energy away from things that really matter. With the analogy of pruning, Jesus encourages us to reduce the excess in our life so that we can flourish. He says, "Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit." And Jesus is what is really important. We hear his message about bearing fruit today in the context of Thoreau's advice to simplify. The quarantine has provided opportunities for us, both inside and outside our homes. For example, many people have developed a habit of walking outside every day now. While hearing bird songs or seeing wildflowers, they have been inspired by the resiliency of God's creation. Other people have taken advantage of the quarantine to give their house a thorough cleaning. They have cleared a lot of clutter that salvagers and sanitation workers have cleared away. A simpler life can mean fewer possessions. This week, one man told me that he had a roommate in grad school who said people shouldn't have more possessions than would fit in a VW Bug. At the time, his roommate didn't own a car or even a bike. But our friend reflected a little further. He said, "It isn't that possessions are bad. Some bring me a lot of joy. The ones that bring me the most joy are the ones that allow me to create meaningful experiences and memories." And he listed two of his most prized possessions, his bike and a book by Dr. Seuss. The bike allows him to get out and see the world and exercise. The Sneetches by Dr. Seuss connects him to his family. He said, "My dad read it to me. I read it to my boys and nieces and nephews, and someday he hopes to read it as a grandparent." Now, I would not say that simplicity equals a lack of possessions, but rather, simplicity is about freedom and meaning. Thoreau chose to live simply so that he could learn what is important. His humble home in the woods allowed him to see the beauty of nature and the dignity of every human being. He found freedom by minimizing his possessions. In that same spirit, Jesus encourages us to simplify, to get rid of the excess in our lives so we can flourish in him. The goal is to devote ourselves to God and live deliberately, to pay attention and awaken to the essential things in life, because, as Thoreau put it, To be awake is to be alive. Amen.